All right. My name is Joanna Woronkowicz, and I'm one of the faculty directors here at the Center for Cultural Affairs. And I'm really pleased today to be talking to an author of one of our recent digest articles, Amanda Ashley. So Amanda Ashley wrote the Micropolitics of Performance, Pop-Up Art as Complementary Method for Civic Engagement and Public Participation, which was recently published in the Journal of Planning, Education, and Research. So thank you, Amanda, for being with me today and agreeing to do this interview.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here, and thanks for having me.
So do you want to introduce yourself, and then we can get into a couple of questions about the article?
Sure. Like you said, my name is Amanda Ashley. I'm an associate professor of urban studies in the School of Public Service at Boise State University, and my PhD is in planning from the University of Pennsylvania. And I do a lot of work on economic and community development, and one of those frames I look at is through the lens of arts and culture.
Excellent. So Amanda is one of the scholars that we are sort of trying to bring into our network here at the Center for Cultural Affairs, and I'm super excited that we can just chat briefly today. So first, I'm just going to say I love the article for two reasons. One is it brings to light this idea of pop-up art, which I don't think everybody really knows what it is. So that's probably the first question I'm going to ask you. But the other part of the article I really like is the data collection that you did in this article. Like, very impressive. You collected all of these instances of pop-up art across the country in these major metro areas. And that was such a unique and useful contribution, I thought. So thanks so much for writing this. This was, I think it was a really great read, and honestly super practical and useful for a lot of practitioners working in the sector. So I guess my first question then is, can you just tell us briefly what art pop-up is, and maybe give us a couple of examples?
Sure. And first of all, thank you for all the kind words that you just said about that work. And I want to make sure that I give credit to my graduate assistant at the time, Erin Mandata, who was like central in helping, think through how you do that kind of exploratory work. And so, Erin, if you're listening, thank you very much for your help. I was really interested just in like the observations I would see in cities or communities about, and in my mind, they were political acts, right? Political in a very kind of broad way. And thinking about tactical urbanism, which a lot of people have written about short-term actions for long-term change. But really focusing on those were art and culture at the center of tactical urbanism. And so kind of like a subset of that activity. And so a couple of examples, that I tried to think through what that actually looks like. And so one of those would be like storefront activation over a temporary period of time, where public art is used to really kind of draw attention to that kind of deactivation and suggest strategies for the ways that we think about vacant space and how to use it. Another example, and how I think a lot about it, is the way that you see kind of guerrilla or infrastructure or wayfinding practices of seed bombing, for example, of where people will take flower seeds, right? A different way of thinking about art and culture, and plant them in vacant lots that are near important communities or neighborhoods to them, to get people to say that this isn't vacant space to them, and what they want it to look like, and the kind of investments that they want to be able to see in that. There's others examples of using designers to think about street furniture and chair bombing, and particularly in places that really haven't been given that same kind of public space activation investments, and to try to help people rethink how that space could be used. So like one of the prime examples I often use in that kind of example is like in Times Square, the debates over using chairs that you could actually move around when they close the street to see what it would actually look like. And I could go on and on about parklets and cyclovias and shared streets, but a lot of this really has to do with rethinking the way of how we use public space, and the way that art and culture is that vehicle for us.
And so you've already mentioned a number of different examples of how these pop-ups relate to urban planning and the goals for urban planning, but I'm wondering, since you looked at this like huge array of projects, you one of the nice things about this article too, I thought, was the taxonomy that you developed for what those major goals are for art pop-ups. And I'm wondering if you could just briefly go over kind of how do art pop-ups relate to urban planning in terms of the goals that they're trying to address in urban planning?
That's a great question. So like taking a step back for a second, I think one of the things I've always wondered is why isn't public art more a part of traditional urban planning practice, given the long history that we know that the way that art and culture shapes our cities and our communities. And there's quite a bit of research out there that suggests that arts and culture does sit on the periphery of practice. Mm-hmm. And so you can, and I could talk for hours about what that means. I won't do that for the sake of this podcast, but I'd be happy to at a different time. But what I, am intrigued by is the way that public art and public artists can contribute to civic dialogues, particularly around planning issues. The way that these kind of pop-up art projects can be ways of pilot testing ideas, particularly for very expensive infrastructure projects, which you know quite a bit about. And also the way that public art can be used to develop different kinds of literacies or competencies for communities about planning topics, whether it's sustainable development or something else. And so for me, the public art really seemed like a way that urban planning could think about civic connection, civic dialogue, civic engagement. And there's been, planners do their best and they're amazing. So many of them are amazing practitioners, but there are also a lot of critiques about the ways in which they do public participation and the formal processes that they provide. And the fact that it's very difficult to figure out other kinds of engagement that happen outside of traditional planning channels and how to make that possible. And so for me, so much of this pop-up art presented an opportunity to think about how planning could remake itself a little bit, and the way that they could do a better job of integrating not just public art, but also public artists into that, into that kind of planning, into that planning process.
Well, that really segues nicely into my last question, which is, what would be your recommendations for using pop-up art, using art pop-ups to achieve these urban planning goals? Like if you could say the top 3 things to urban plannings or urban planners or people working within arts organizations or city government, what would you say?
So I would say that there are a lot. Let me think. I could say I had like 12. I'm going to narrow it down to 3, Joanna. I think one of the things that I thought was pretty amazing in that article, there's a case I talk about in Austin called 20 Foot Wide. And they talk about the challenges of building codes and planning codes of being able to pull off these pop-up art projects. And so they actually commissioned a report to be able to make recommendations about how some of that stuff could be altered or changed to make these kinds of tactical urbanism efforts more likely, more probable, more successful, and how to also not just make them happen, but how to actually translate them into change. And so I think because so many communities are context specific, you and I were talking earlier about how Austin is different than where I live in Boise, is different than what happens in a lot of other communities. And so that kind of report work, I think, is really, really important, number one. Number two, I would strongly encourage planners and people that do that art and cultural work to convene together to talk about the ways that art and culture actually can be at the center of planning rather than a periphery or something that's thought about in those kinds of ways. And number 3, I think that there are a lot of art and cultural plans out there. And I look at this in a lot of my other research that do tend to be more of marketing documents, and they do a really great job identifying, cataloging the kinds of investments that communities have. But I think I would like to see them talk more about how they can contribute to that planning conversation as well, in terms of making different types of changes in planning practice, and also just in like straight up building codes and a variety of other channels. So those are the 3 that I can think of off the top of my head.
Oh, that's excellent. I mean, I for sure will be asking you if you can visit virtually my cultural planning class to impart some knowledge and possibly say some things that I don't know. So that's so nice. So thank you, Amanda, so much for meeting with me and doing this interview. Again, this is Amanda Ashley, one of the authors of our article recently featured on this last issue of the Digest. Thank you so much. And go ahead. Sorry.
I also just wanted to say that the center that you're a faculty director for has been life-changing for me and is so important to so many people that do research in art and culture and bringing us all together. So thank you for having me here and for all the great work that you do.
Thank you, Amanda. And I promise not to edit that part out. So
That's good.
All right. So catch the catch the recent issue of our digest on our center website, culturalaffairs.indiana.edu. We do the digest twice a year, and we hope to be offering more sort of interpretive videos of all of the articles that we feature with the authors of those articles. So thanks so much, and we'll see you soon.